Hey friends, K. Albert Little here from the Cordial Catholic with a video response to my friend Dr. Gavin Orland's video on Does Augustine Affirm Sola Scriptura? This is a response video. If you want to read a full-length written response I have done, a 21-pager that this video is a synthesis of, check in the link in the description below. I've linked to my blog and that much longer article I have written in response to this, which includes a lot more details. This is a synthesis of that. Okay, first things first, I recognize right away that I'm highly outmatched in responding to this video. Gavin is Dr. Gavin Orland. He has a PhD in this area. He's published many times over in this area. And I'm a lowly blogger behind a microphone, a podcaster who talks to smart Catholics every week and brings you their interviews. So I'm outmatched here entirely. And so it's in humility that I wanted to submit this for feedback. Gavin asked for us to go over his sources, look at those in context, don't take his word for it. So I have done that. I am doing that and giving my feedback like this, knowing that I am highly outmatched. So humbly submitting this for YouTube to eat alive, potentially. Second thing is this. This is not and hasn't been framed as a Catholic versus Protestant argument. Gavin's done a great job in explaining that. But just for the listeners and viewers to understand, even if we find that someone like Augustine does affirm Sola Scriptura, this wouldn't necessarily undermine or move the Catholic belief in any way. The Church doesn't form their beliefs based on one or two different bishops, but on the collective of bishops and how that is seen in councils and these various different mechanisms. We call the magisterium and apostolic succession and these kinds of things. So that's to say one bishop in the long scheme of things, if they are found to affirm Sola Scriptura, wouldn't really be a defeater for the Catholic position in any way, shape, or form. It's just not how it works. So this isn't that kind of debate. Okay, let's get into it. Dr. Orland's given us 3 quotations to dig into that he says affirms his view of Sola Scriptura, which he defines as Scripture being the sole infallible rule of faith, rule for Christian faith and morals, is how he's defined it. So, given us 3 quotations, I want to dig into those quotations, look at the context of those quotations, and show you why I think they're not a really good evidence to back up that thesis. Let's begin with the first quotation. I'll read that, and then we'll dig into the context of this. This comes from On Baptism, Augustine's work Against the Donatists, Book 2, and here's what it says. But who can fail to be aware that the sacred canon of Scripture, both of the Old and New Testament, is confined within its own limits, and that it stands so absolutely in a superior position to all later letters of bishops that, about it, we can hold no manner of doubt or disputation whether what is confessedly contained in it is right and true, but that all the letters of bishops which have been written or are being written since the closing of the canon are liable to be refuted if there be anything contained in them which strays from the truth, either by the discourse of someone who happens to be wiser in the matter than themselves, or by the weightier authority and more learned experience of other bishops, by the authority of councils, and further to that, the councils themselves, which are held in the several districts and provinces, must yield beyond all possibility of doubt to the authority of the plenary councils, which are formed for the whole Christian world, and that even the plenary councils, the earlier, are often corrected by those which follow them, when, by some actual experiment, things are brought to light which were before concealed, and that is known which were previously lay hidden, and this without any whirlwind of sacrilegious pride, without any puffing of the neck through arrogance, without any strife of envious hatred, simply with holy humility, Catholic peace, and Christian charity. Okay, let's dig into the context for this quotation and try and unpack some of this stuff here. This was written by Augustine to this Christian sect called the Donatists, who evidently, in the context of this section of the book in this letter, were holding up Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, who I guess spoke about something that agreed with their view on baptism, who could be baptized, who could be admitted into the church. Cyprian said something that agreed with their view, and they're presenting Cyprian as this bishop who's written a letter or said some words that affirms their point of view. Now, in that context, this is Augustine's response. So keep in mind, he's not responding to a question like, is Sola Scriptura the infallible rule for Christian faith and morals? He's not writing in response to a question like that. He's more closely writing to a question that would be something like, is a bishop's letter more authoritative than Scripture? That's more the response that he's writing towards. He's writing to these Donatists and essentially saying to them, no, this bishop says this thing, but he doesn't speak for the entire church. He's liable to be refuted. And this is exactly what happens in this quotation here from Augustine. In that context, I would argue he's saying two things here. Rather than, as Dr. Ortlund asserts, he's saying that Scripture is over everything. In the question he's responding to, he's saying, I believe Scripture is greater than the letter of a bishop, and then all this other stuff is also greater than a letter of a bishop. And this, I think, is pretty clear from the quotation if you read it in that context. First of all, Scripture is above bishops' letters, and then bishops' letters are also subservient to these kinds of things, other wiser bishops, regional councils, and then plenary or ecumenical councils. There's, I think, and I argue, not one linear chain of authority here with Scripture at the top, as Gavin asserts, but two paths of authority, kind of a dual network, a dual chain of authority. On one side, letter of the bishop, subservient to Scripture. On the other side, everything else that a letter of a bishop is subservient to. And I think a close reading of this quotation reveals that to be the case. Remember, the question isn't about Sola Scriptura, isn't about is Scripture the infallible rule of faith. It is about the authority that a bishop's letter carries. And I think what happens later in here in this exact same letter is pretty telling. Now, you would expect if Augustine meant this to be a universally applied rule. Okay, so maybe he's talking about a letter to the bishop, but maybe he actually did mean Sola Scriptura over everything else, and we're reading him wrong. You'd expect him to demonstrate that, I think, in how he handles this dispute. So what does he do? Actually, he circles back around to the plenary council, right? Which I would say, in my argument, is one of the ends of those two dual chains of authority, Scripture over letters of bishops, and then everything else over letters of bishops, ending with a plenary council, as we've gone through. But he doesn't, in settling the dispute with the Donatists, go back to Scripture as the ultimate authority. He actually goes back to a council. He says, effectively, if Cyprian were here, he would bring this, and this came to a council, he would submit to the council. Here's what he says. Here's the exact quotation. And this comes from, later on in the letter, it comes from 2.4.5. Nor should we ourselves venture to assert anything of the kind, were we not supported by the unanimous authority of the whole church, to which he himself, Cyprian, would unquestionably have yielded if at that time the truth of this question had been placed beyond dispute by the investigation and decree of a plenary council. So think about this. If Augustine truly meant that Sola Scriptura was the sole rule of faith, that's what he was trying to say in this section, in this quote, in this book, we would expect him to circle back around to Scripture to settle this debate. But he doesn't. In fact, he says if Cyprian were here and this question came before council, he would yield to council. And here's what I think is most interesting. Earlier, Augustine has called Scripture beyond dispute. Here, he calls the council beyond dispute. He says this question had been placed beyond dispute by the investigation and decree of a plenary council. So, in my thesis, interestingly enough, this beyond dispute is used to describe both Scripture by Augustine and in the same letter, also the plenary council. So, what's happening here? I think what Dr. Ortlund can show from this quotation is that certainly Augustine places Scripture above the letter of a bishop, but I would argue he also places other things over letters of a bishop. And this is not a competition between Scripture and, say, a council, but there are dual chains of authority here at play, both of which he ends up calling beyond dispute. When you get to the bottoms of these chains, whether it's Scripture or council, he calls them both beyond dispute. Okay. The second quotation that Dr. Ortlund provides for us comes from Augustine's letter 82. Let's read it here and then dig into the context. I confess to your charity that I have learned to yield this respect and honor only to the canonical books of Scripture. Of these alone do I most firmly believe that the authors were completely free of error. Okay, free from error, only Scripture. That does sound pretty damning to our case. But what's Augustine actually saying? What actually is super clear here, as Dr. Ortlund asserts in his video. Let's look at the context. Okay, so this is a letter in a long chain between Augustine and Jerome. This is taking place at a time when Jerome is translating the Latin Vulgate, and the church is wrestling with how to understand the place of Scripture, as it would in the young church, figuring these things out. And in and amongst a dialogue about manuscripts, and can manuscripts err, and can translations err, and are the translators themselves protected by infallibility, and these sorts of discussions, the discussion crops up with the idea that in one of Jerome's commentaries on Galatians, I think it is, he makes a remark that perhaps it's possible that Paul lied or misspoke or misrepresented himself when he talked about correcting Peter at the Council of Jerusalem, or this idea of Peter's sin, right, with the Gentiles. And Augustine takes issue with this, and I encourage you, much like the first quotation, read this quotation in context, in that context of this exchange of letters, because it's very illuminating in that context. Because what I argue here is happening is Augustine is not talking about Sola Scriptura, right? The question that was not put to him, again, is Scripture the sole infallible rule of faith? It's not the question he's answering. The question he's actually answering is, could Paul misrepresent himself or tell a lie? Or could an author of the Gospels or the Epistles put a false fact in there? Could that actual nature be false? They're wrestling with this. In the myriad of translation and of manuscripts and these kinds of questions, this is the exact topic they're wrestling with. And just to illuminate this a little bit further, if we go on a bit further, here's what, in that same section, here's what Augustine continues to say. He says this: "And if in these writings I'm perplexed by anything which appears to me to be opposed to truth, I do not hesitate to suppose that either the manuscript is faulty, or the translator has not caught the meaning of what was said, or I myself have failed to understand it. As to all other writings, in reading them, however great the superiority of the authors to myself in sanctity and learning, I do not accept their teachings as true on the mere ground of the opinion being held by them, but only because they have succeeded in convincing my judgment of its truth either by means of these canonical writings themselves or by arguments addressed to my reason. I believe, my brother, that this is your opinion as well as mine. I do not need to say anything that I do not need to say that I do not suppose you to wish your books to be read like those of the prophets or apostles, concerning which it would be wrong to doubt that they are free from error." Okay, in context, what's happening here is Augustine is saying, look, when I encounter a supposed error in Scripture, I'm going to side with Scripture every single time. And Jerome, I know that you might wish your books to be read as free from error, but they're simply not. Okay? What do we have here? We have Augustine and Jerome talking about writing, about writings that are free from error. This is the context here. And interestingly enough, there's nowhere in this letter or series of letters where the authority of Scripture is pitted against councils or anything like that. We're talking merely about writing. And what I argue this quotation affirms quite clearly is that Augustine viewed Scripture as infallible and all other kinds of writing as possible to be wrong, to be fallible. This is the scope here. And to remove this from that context, I think does violence to the text here. It's just ripping it out of that context, and it's not what it actually was meaning to say. I want to take some examples here. And the first comes from 2 Timothy 3:16. Now, this is a popular verse that's bandied about by poor non-Catholic apologists to say, look, Scripture alone. Poor apologists, of which Gavin is not in that class, but we'll use this for an illustration, okay? This verse clearly says that all Scripture is God-breathed. Now, bad apologists take this to mean that only Scripture is God-breathed. But note that the word only does not appear in this text anywhere. It's saying all Scripture is God-breathed. It's not commentating on what else might also be God-breathed or what isn't God-breathed. Only that all Scripture is God-breathed. Okay? I take this letter from Augustine to be in a similar vein. And this mistake that is being made here to be a similar mistake by taking this out of context. Because what Augustine is saying is that he believes all these books to be free from error. So in the category of books, the only books that are free from error are the scriptures, not Jerome's books, not other commentaries, not even necessarily a manuscript copy of one of these parts of scripture or a translation, but the scriptures themselves are infallible. So in the category of books, the only books that are infallible are the scriptures. What's happening here, though, is we're shifting this to mean the only thing that's infallible is scriptures, which isn't what Augustine is saying, right? It's like taking Paul out of context by saying only scriptures are infallible. Here we're saying the only thing that's infallible are scriptures, rather than what Augustine is actually saying, which is the only kinds of books that are infallible are scriptures. It's a categorical mistake to take this out of that category of books and try to apply it to, well, everything, especially in this context when Jerome and Augustine are merely talking about books. And Augustine goes on in the very next paragraph after this to dig into the precise dispute that they're talking about in Galatians with Paul and Peter, not coming back to this idea of scriptures being above everything else, but dealing with an actual place where they differ in their opinion of the infallibility of scripture. But we're just talking about kinds of books here, not applying this to everything. One more example. If somebody were to overhear me in a conversation about theologians and I say Ratzinger is the best, and somebody hears that and takes that out of context and says, oh, he thinks Ratzinger is the best human being ever. Well, that would be a ridiculous mistake to make. First of all, my wife would be very insulted because she's actually the best human being, of course. But second of all, I was talking about theologians who I think are the best. It would be a mistake to pull that out of context and say, I meant the best people in the world, right? It's an obvious mistake. The same thing, I argue, is happening here. Augustine's talking about the books, and the only infallible books he believes that are free from error are the scriptures, but within the category of books and of writing, not as a universal rule. And I think to pull this out of context and to apply it in a universal rule, I think really doesn't make sense in the context of this discussion. I think it's really reaching. The final piece of evidence we're going to deal with here comes from Contra Faustumus. The final piece of evidence here comes from Augustine's book, a reply to Faustus, against Faustus, book number 11. Let's read the quotation and then dig into the context here. As regards our writings, which are not a rule of faith or practice, but only a help to edification, we may suppose that they contain some things falling short of truth in obscure and recondite matters, and that these mistakes may or may not be corrected in subsequent treatises. For all of those of whom the apostle spoke, and if you be otherwise minded, God shall reveal even this unto you. Such writings are read with the right of judgment and without any obligation to believe. In order to leave room for such profitable discussions of difficult questions, there is a boundary line separating all productions subsequent to the apostolic times from the authoritative canonical books of the Old and New Testaments. Okay, again, recognizing that this is not a response to Augustine being asked, what is the sole infallible rule of faith? The context for this actually is Augustine writing a kind of posthumous exchange with Faustus, a disgraced, deceased bishop who held some pretty weird ideas about the Catholic faith. And Augustine is kind of systematically dismantling his different teachings. And in this case, here again is a similar theme. This is Faustus holding the idea that Paul may have corrected himself or misrepresented himself or been misrepresented incorrectly somewhere in the Bible. And these kind of mistakes can creep into the Bible. And what he's doing is replying to this, right? This idea. And now there are a couple indications here that this quotation has been taken out of context to affirm the view of Sola Scriptura, which has been presented here in Dr. Ortland's videos. And the first one is the phrase, as regards our writing. Okay? Right away, we're framing this conversation in terms of writing. So again, like the quote with Jerome and Augustine, we're talking in the category of writings, not of all things are infallible, but of writings that are infallible. And Augustine goes on to say that there's a distinct boundary line between the writings of the Old and New Testament and everything that came afterwards. I think we're fine to affirm that. That is what he is talking about as being infallible. The scriptures and everything else following that is not infallible, including commentaries, other people's opinions, and all these kinds of things. So I think, again, what's important here to recognize is that we're taking this quotation out of context. He's talking about writing. He said the scriptures have a certain sacredness, certain peculiarity, which is unique to them, and other things don't have that. But he isn't expanding this to mean all kinds of things. He's talking here about writing, and actually never comes back in this section, in this book, to talk about councils or any other authority structure, because that's simply not what he's talking about here. In fact, the only time he ever again mentions bishops and councils in this whole section here is talk about how scriptures have their authority because they came down from bishops in apostolic succession in this kind of authoritative continuum. Okay? So it's, I think, again, a case of being something that's out of context and simply was not in the category that Augustine was talking about. He's not talking anywhere in this letter, this section, about kinds of authority, isn't answering the question about is Sola Scriptura the sole rule of faith, or scriptures the only infallible thing. We're talking as regards our writings in the category here of writing. Okay, let's sum these three arguments up. First of all, in the letter to the Donatists, I think the problem here is that there are dual chains of authority, both being called beyond dispute, being, I think, muddled here. What Augustine lays out is two ways of knowing if a bishop's letter is authoritative or not. He says, compared to scripture, no, it is not. Compared to all these other things here, including councils, no, it is not. But he's not trying to explain the sole rule of faith for Christian morals and teachings. He's replying to a question about the letters of a bishop, and that's it. And in fact, the fact that he calls both those things beyond dispute, councils and scripture, really begs the question of what's going on here. I think if Dr. Ortlund is going to respond to this, he has to show us exactly why there isn't two lines of authority here, how exactly scripture in the context of this quotation is above everything else when it looks like two distinct lines of authority, and what to make of both of those things, plenary councils and scripture, being called beyond dispute, if this is really this one linear chain of authority. Second, I tried to show that the quote with the letter from Jerome was actually taken out of context. It's a discussion between two theologians in a new and emerging church trying to wrestle with how it understands scripture and translation and manuscripts and these kinds of things. A discussion about a mistake possibly in the scriptures, or misrepresentation, or a lie told by an apostle. And it's in this context that Augustine says, no, scriptures are infallible, but our writings, our commentaries, even our manuscripts in some cases, those can be fallible, but in terms of writings, scriptures are the only infallible kind of writing. It's in that category. I think to prove his point here, Gavin needs to show us how, even ripped out of that context, the clear context of those letters and that exchange, this is somehow meant to be a universal rule applied to all authority, scripture being over all, rather than just about writing, as the quotation would suggest in context. Finally, we looked at the reply to Faustus, Book 11, in which Augustine is talking about, again, this kind of error creeping up into Scripture, or something being misremembered or misrepresented in Scripture, and how to wrestle with that. And again, I would argue, similar to Jerome's letter, we're talking about a categorical mistake here. This is clearly a case of referring to our writing. He says, as regards our writing. So, of course, yeah, we can affirm here that Scriptures are infallible, the only infallible kind of writing according to Augustine. But I think if Dr. Orland's going to show us that he means that to apply to every kind of authority, Scripture over everything else, for the sole infallible rule of Christian faith and morals, the only infallible rule for Christian faith and morals, I think he has to show us how even out of context, or in the context, this statement to regards to Faustus applies. How even though it says, as regards our writing, what he actually means is a universal rule that applies to everything, and Scripture being the only thing, even in other categories, that's infallible. I think that's what Dr. Orland needs to show us if we're going to settle that case. Well, there you go, friends. There's my case. There's my response. I think I've shown that these three quotations really don't underpin the idea of Augustine affirming Sola Scriptura. I think there's a lot of room for doubt in there as that being what he was after in any of these quotes. But again, I'm humbly submitting this to you to read and listen to, watch, and share your thoughts. The full response, written response, is linked below in the description. Please do interact with this video, like it, share it, leave some comments. I'd love to know what you guys think of this. Yeah, there you go. Thank you for watching, friends. And again, humbly submitting this to the interwebs. Thanks for watching, guys. God bless.